And quite often, the way that the care sheet tells people how to care for them is so wrong. And I've likened it to on a previous episode, like the game Telephone. I don't. You have that game Telephone in the UK where you have kids and you sit them in a circle and you give one like a sentence, whatever the sentence is, and then they tell it to each other. And by the end, it gets to the end of the circle, it's something completely different. And almost that's how this care of a common species like a leopard gecko has happened. You have generations of people who've been caring for them, and slowly over time, people have been adding their own thing to it, and now it's just sand and a cactus and no water and we're good to go. So you really kind of dissect this in that video. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that one.
When it comes to the leopard geckos one, they've always been touted as desert animals, as arid, which, I mean, it's a fair assumption if you look at one. Their coloration looks deserty, especially the original ones where we're not talking about morphs, which you won't catch me talking very much about morphs. I'm just not interested in it. But again, where's the information about the original ones that were caught up in the wild and then sold into the hobby? Nowhere. Again, the animals came in and guesswork, so got some of them to survive. What we need is people actually out there on foot getting habitat conditions. And the video goes into a few of the studies that have shown where these animals have been found. Really surprising places, really surprising conditions as well. Both by temperatures, the amount of moisture. I mean, who would stereotypically imagine leopard gecko and monsoon being discussed in the same sentence?
Right.
But they absolutely do experience things like monsoons. And one of those people is Ben Owens over at Captive and Field Herpetology. I shout out massively on the video. So a couple of years ago, I think it was 2018 was the first one, or 2019, he went out to India, found some leopard geckos, thought that was brilliant, especially where he found them. Before he spoke about it, he went and confirmed the species for DNA work, that they are the exact ones that we keep in captivity. Same species, same line of the ones that were originally captured and imported to us. And they're in wet woodland, mossy, wet, cool woodland.
Lush. Yeah.
Lush, lots of plants. Sure, sand and rock is there, but the way they're living is nowhere near how we're keeping them in captivity. They're living in rock wall tunnels and coming out and exploring and trying to catch all sorts of food on various substrates. Even up in dead trees, they've been found in hollows of dead trees, in places that will get flooded with moisture. And I'll go into a lot of the specifics in the video, don't I? Trying to compile these different aspects of the wild environment that we know of now. But what that video shows is what we don't know.
Exactly.
Just because I've compiled that and that information from brilliant people that have gone out there and found those animals and tried to get habitat data, specific stuff, like Ben goes out there with the solar meter and such to actually find out what that habitat data is. I still wouldn't say we know enough about the leopard gecko to be able to recreate its wild environment.
Which is so shocking to say, considering how popular of an animal it is, how often it's kept, and how long we've been keeping it in captivity. But it's amazing. You think this is a popular species, they got to be running around everywhere in the wild. And if you go to Google Images and search wild leopard gecko, you get like 3 pictures. And Ben has done some work, and a few researchers have done work, but it's not. Or you can maybe go to iNaturalist, but it's just there's not a lot out there, which is really strange.
It's the same for a lot of common stuff.
Right.
Ball pythons, as you'll know them out there, Regius. They try and find wild habitat data on them. Despite the fact how many millions of them are in captivity.
It's amazing.
Incredibly difficult. There are a few brilliant sources of information and individuals to get their own experiences. And funnily enough, some of the only scientific sources of information absolutely rewrite the book on how they're kept.
Right.
It actually, it's upsetting when you read it and then look at how they're kept in captivity. But we don't know. And what that really emphasizes is not that there are certain ways of keeping these animals. Again, going back to advancing herb husbandry being tarred as that you have to do things in certain ways. God, no. From the information we're finding, what we want is to give the animals choice.
Mm-hmm.
Give the animals choice of conditions rather than a static enclosure with, this temperature on the one side, this temperature on the other, and a rock here and this light exactly here. How about we start keeping in larger enclosures, much larger, where we can provide one very, well, this is an example just for leopard geckos, but one very, very warm area, then tunnels that get various temperatures and humidities. And then as the enclosure goes, it gets darker and darker and cooler and cooler. Essentially, I'd like an enclosure to be peak temperature on one side and then a couple meters away, cooler than a hobbyist would usually let their reptile get.
Mm-hmm.
People are so afraid of the cold.
Yes, that's true.
Seriously afraid of the cold for their reptiles, and it blows my mind. And they don't realize how cold it gets in the wild sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Just as a random example. Choice, gradients, both for temperature, humidity, UV, ambient lighting, all of it should be a gradient to give them the choice.
Mm-hmm.
And as we go back to the learnt behaviors and brain plasticity, if you start an animal like that, watch its behaviors, watch it learn where to go at certain points of day in your specific enclosure, just like they would in the wild. They will learn where their favorite places are. They will learn if they're not, if they're coming up to a shed, that there is a certain tunnel that gets us to a certain humidity that they will go and lie in. Whereas if we're keeping in classic hobby methods, going back to tubs, the classic example. Again, I'm not arguing tubs are bad. That whole thing, tubs can be done right, but who is actually doing that? I know probably like 3 people in the hobby wide that might be keeping well in tubs. So let's all be honest and admit that a lot of racks and tubs really aren't being used well. And giving an animal one temperature, one humidity, one light level, and saying it's correct when we frankly do not know what correct is.
Yeah. Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head and you took the words right out of my mouth, is enclosure size. And I think that is something that needs to be greatly increased, like even for myself. Like now I've just, in the last couple of months, I've just really become aware of how small enclosures are. And now when I look at my enclosures, I don't see a beautiful, well-planted enclosure. I see a small box, and it's kind of sad. And you just see the walls for some reason. I'm not sure what happened with my perspective shift, but suddenly I just see walls. And I really desperately want to change this, and I will over time. And I want to see that in the hobby as well. You could